A Great Argead Saga Alexander the Great. Volume 2, Hieros Lachus, The Sacred Band. By Macaulay Naki. Episode 23. A Faltering Spear in Thessaly. The dust of Macedon had barely settled from Pelopidas's boots, and the cheers of Thebes' homecoming still echoed faintly in his memory, when the relentless demands of hegemony pulled him back north. A year that seemed determined to test the limits of Theban endurance. The Macedonian intervention had been swift, decisive, and, in its way, satisfying, a volatile kingdom brought to heel, a future king secured as a pledge. But the Viper of Thessaly, Alexander of Pherae, merely coiled tighter, waiting. Is the ink on the Macedonian treaty even dry yet? Pelopidas thought, tightening his grip on the reins as his horse kicked up a cloud of gray dust across the southern borders. We leave one nest of vipers only to walk directly into the jaws of another. The northern frontier is a hydra, cut off one head and three more rise to strike. Pelopidas rode with a smaller, swifter force this time, not out of a lack of silver or a miserly state treasury, but because he traveled as an emissary of the Supreme League, believing this mission to be a routine political parley to address the grievances of the pressed Thessalian cities rather than an all-out campaign. He was accompanied by a lean cadre of seasoned Theban veterans and a small, eager contingent of Thessalian allies who thirsted for decisive action against their tyrant. The sun beat down with a late summer intensity, baking the fertile plains of Thessaly into a cracked, dusty expanse. The air shimmered, distorting the distant hills. Pelopidas felt the familiar hum of purpose, a warrior's readiness, but perhaps, too, a subtle undercurrent of overconfidence. He had faced Alexander before, had outmaneuvered him, had seen the tyrant buckle. This time, he intended to settle the ledger permanently. He is a coward at heart, Pelopidas mused, watching the heat haze dance across the horizon, his hand resting casually on his sword hilt. A petty warlord who rules by terror rather than respect, hiding behind mercenary shields. Show him the absolute authority of the Theban hegemony, and he will fold just as he did before. The reports are consistent. General Ismenias, riding closely at his side, stated, his voice tight with an unspoken, clawing premonition. He adjusted the strap of his bronze breastplate, his eyes darting toward the distant rolling shadows of the Pheraean hills. Alexander has fortified his city heavily since your last visit. My scouts say he has doubled his foreign guard, and his agents whisper of a new ruthlessness in his tax collections, a desperation that makes him far more dangerous than an open, honest enemy. Pelopidas turned slightly in his saddle, his weather-beaten face lined with the hard-earned authority of a man who had liberated Thebes from the Spartan yoke. Desperation breeds mistakes, Ismenias. It is the signature of a crumbling regime, or a cornered beast, Ismenias countered sharply, his horse tossing its head as if echoing his anxiety. We crossed into Thessaly with barely a handful of cohorts, General. We came as diplomats carrying the weight of the council, but Alexander recognizes only the weight of a pike. If he chooses to ignore the laws of guest right and treat us as prey, we have neither the numbers to fight our way out nor the walls to shelter behind. Pelopidas let out a low, confident laugh, though his sharp eyes never stopped scanning the horizon. Alexander does not dare lift a hand against a representative of the sacred Boeotian League. He knows that if a single hair on our heads is harmed, Epaminondas will march an entire army to race Pherae down to its foundations. The tyrant values his own skin far too much to gamble on an act of open madness. And yet, a quiet, nagging voice echoed in the back of Pelopidas's mind, completely unvoiced to his loyal lieutenant. The wind in Thessaly always feels heavier than the air in Boeotia. Why do I feel as though we are walking straight into a snare of our own pride? He pushed the dark thought aside, urging his mount faster down the sun-baked road. Ahead, the towers of Pherae rose like jagged teeth against the pale sky, silent, watchful, and waiting. Shadow over Thessaly. The morning air in Boeotia was sharp and crisp, carrying the scent of burning olive wood and baking barley bread from the kitchens of Pamin's estate. Around the sun-warmed courtyard table sat the master of the house, alongside a tightly knit circle of young northern exiles and squires. Philip, Antigonus, Pethan, Leonidas, and Amintor. Yet the usual light-hearted banter of the morning meal was entirely swallowed by a fresh dispatch that lay unrolled on the stone table between their plates. A courier's urgent plea from Thessaly begging for immediate Theban intervention to strip the tyrannical Alexander of Pherae of his power once and for all. Philip stared down at the damp papyrus, his gray eyes narrowing as he turned over the tactical absurdity of the initial deployment in his mind. Why would General Pelopidas and Ismenias go there with no army at all to face a tyrant like Alexander? Philip asked, his voice sharp and analytical, breaking the heavy silence. To walk right into Pherae without a shield wall or a phalanx, it's not boldness. It's an invitation to a trap. Pamines, seated at the head of the table, sliced a piece of fresh cheese with his dagger, his expression grim as he looked across at the young Argead prince. Pelopidas chose a smaller, swifter force for a precise reason. Philip, Pamines explained, leaning forward. The reason he had a dangerously small force, or rather no army at all, was not because of money or financial restrictions. He traveled as an ambassador, not a general. Pelopidas went to Thessaly on a diplomatic mission to address the bitter complaints of the oppressed cities against the tyrant. Because he expected a routine political parley and anticipated no immediate military opposition, he brought only a minimal personal escort. A diplomat walking into a den of wolves with empty hands, Philip thought, a cold flash of skepticism tightening his jaw. Men like Alexander don't care about diplomatic robes or sacred councils. They only understand the point of a spear. A mentor, leaning back against his chair with a thoughtful smirk, shook his head and tapped his fingers against the wooden table. General Pelopidas went with no army, yes, but in a way, that absence was his weapon. He brought an army of nothing to be his army. Pethan blinked, furrowing his brow in absolute confusion. An army of nothing? How can nothing fight a tyrant, a mentor? That sounds like a fast track to a shallow grave. Think Pethan, a mentor pressed on, gesturing broadly with his hand. If Pelopidas had marched a full Theban levy across the border, it would have shown that Thebes was openly preparing for immediate war. It would have put Alexander on high alert, locking his gates and marshalling every mercenary from here to the sea. But by bringing no army to face him, Pelopidas tied the tyrant's hands. How do you openly butcher an unarmed ambassador of the ruling hegemony without uniting all of Greece against your throat? The lack of an army was the general's shield. Antigonus, however, bristled at the logic, his hand instinctively dropping to the hilt of his eating knife as a dark memory flickered across his face. Can a madman like Alexander really be trusted with niceties? Antigonus challenged, his voice tight with bitter warning. They ambushed us during our own march just to get here to Thebes. Alexander does the unthinkable. He deals in absolute treachery. A beast who butchers the rules of war shouldn't be handled with diplomatic kid gloves lightly. Philip shook his head slowly, staring at the wax seal of the dispatch. I don't think so, he muttered quietly, his mind racing through the dangerous calculus of the tyrant's psychology. Alexander isn't just a brute, he's a gambler. And a gambler backed into a corner will always make the worst possible move when stripped of his predex. Pamines tossed his napkin onto the table and pushed himself up from his chair, the bronze greaves on his shins clanking sharply in the morning air. Gods only know what madness is unfolding in Thessaly right now, Pamines said, his tone shifting from debate to the unyielding discipline of the Cadmea. Word has been sent and the council will deliberate. But until the orders drop from the polemarchs, we do not stand around speculating. Get up, all of you, we have to move to morning training. Golden Cage of Syracuse. The heavy bronze doors of the inner citadel at Syracuse closed with a dull, echoing thud, sealing away the Mediterranean sun and leaving the long vaulted hall bathed in the cool, flickering amber of oil lamps. Plato stood near the edge of the polished marble floor, his fingers tracing the edge of a wax tablet covered in sharp geometric proofs. At 61 years old, his bones ached with the fatigue of the long voyage from Athens, but a heavier weight pressed upon his mind. Around him, the court of Dionysius II hummed with a nervous, suppressed energy, a labyrinth of whispers, sidelong glances, and silk-clad courtiers, whose loyalties shifted like the sea. We came to forge a king, Plato thought, his gaze drifting toward the empty ivory throne at the head of the chamber. Instead, we are trying to tame a shadow. Across the hall, standing by a towering porphyry column, Dion watched the shadows with a jaw set so tight his teeth ached. The assassination of the elder Dionysius had opened a fragile window. a rare historical breath between tyrannies. Dion had spent months convincing Plato to cross the Ionian Sea once more, staking everything on the intoxicating dream that abstract geometry and moral philosophy could bridle absolute power. "He keeps us waiting again," Dion murmured softly, stepping up beside the philosopher, his voice laced with bitter frustration. The boy spends his mornings listening to flatterers who tell him a tyrant needs no masters, yet he demands that we lecture him on temperance by afternoon. He is terrified of his own crown, Plato thought, looking at Dion's strained profile. Dionysius wears the absolute power of his father, like an ill-fitting bronze breastplate, too heavy to lift, yet too precious to put down. "Patience, Dion," Plato replied aloud, his voice calm, steady, and measured against the rising storm. "Iron is not shaped by a single stroke, nor is a soul awakened by a single lecture. If we rush the forge, the metal shatters." A rustle of velvet and the sharp clink of gold-trimmed sandals broke the silence. Emerging from the private royal chambers came the young ruler himself, Dionysius II. His youthful face bore the unmistakable exhaustion of sleepless nights, his eyes darting restlessly from the guards at the door to the two Athenians waiting before him. "They look at me as if I were a cage," Dionysius thought, his stomach tightening as he met Plato's unblinking philosophical gaze. "Dion wants to turn me into an austere Spartan magistrate, and my courtiers want me to rule with a bloodied whip. Why must every man in this city demand that I be someone else?" Dionysius forced an uneasy, defiant smile, lifting his chin as he approached the throne. "Well, Athenians? Have you come to prove to me once again that a tyrant is no better than a slave to his own passions?" Plato stepped forward, the wax tablet resting quietly in his palm. "No, your majesty," Plato thought, stepping into the lion's den of absolute power. "We have come to show you that true freedom begins where tyranny ends." "Not a slave, sire," Plato said aloud, his voice echoing smoothly through the vaulted hall. "Merely a ruler waiting to discover whether he commands his empire, or his empire commands him. Shall we return to the circles on the sand?" The afternoon sun cut through the high clerestory lattice of the private study, casting long geometric shadows across a freshly smoothed bed of fine white sand laid out upon a low oak table. Plato knelt beside the table, a bronze stylus poised delicately above the grains. Around them, the heavy velvet draperies of the Syracusan palace seemed to muffle even the sound of the sea outside, leaving only the sound of heavy breathing and rustling silk. Dionysius II stood over the table, his arms crossed tightly across his embroidered tunic, his jaw clenched in sullen resistance. Just weeks into their grand experiment, the initial novelty of the philosopher's presence had curdled into the bitter friction of a master and an unyielding pupil. Why must he always reduce the universe to lines and ratios? Dionysius thought, glaring down at the perfect triangle traced in the sand. He speaks of justice as if it were a theorem, a neat proof on a slate. He forgets that I command legions, that men plot my murder in the dark corridors of this very citadel, and that a single misstep means my throat is slit from ear to ear. "Look closely at the angles, sire," Plato said quietly, his voice devoid of the obsequious flattery the young tyrant was accustomed to hearing from his courtiers. "A true geometric proof does not bend to the will of the drawer. It is balanced, harmonious, and immutable, just so is the soul of a just king." Dionysius let out a sharp, cynical laugh that echoed harshly against the stone walls. "He thinks he can bridle absolute power with chalk and sand," Dionysius thought, a flash of defensive anger tightening his chest. "If I show weakness, if I govern by balance and restraint as he commands, my uncles and my guards will tear me apart. Philosophy is a luxury for men who do not sit on a throne of knives." "You speak of immutable laws, Athenian," Dionysius challenged aloud, leaning over the sand table, his eyes locking onto Plato's unblinking gaze. "You sit in your groves in Athens and imagine that an empire can be governed by drawing triangles. My father did not rule Sicily by geometric harmony. He ruled it with steel, fear, and absolute command. Are you telling me that power is worthless unless it obeys your abstract rules?" Plato did not flinch. He slowly lowered the stylus, letting the bronze point rest against the frame of the table. The boy mistakes terror for strength, Plato thought, a wave of profound sorrow washing over the aging philosopher. He is trapped inside the gilded cage of his father's tyranny, terrified that if he loosens the grip of the whip for even a second, the abyss will swallow him. Power without wisdom, sire, is merely the freedom to destroy oneself at a grander scale, Plato replied, his tone steady and unyielding. The tyrant believes he is master of everyone, yet he is the slave of his own unbridled fears. A true king rules others only because he has first learned to master himself. Will you govern by the eternal order of justice, or will you remain a captive to your own passions? Silence fell over the chamber, heavy and suffocating, as the two wills clashed across the table of sand, the absolute autocrat clinging to his inheritance, and the philosopher demanding nothing less than the total death of the tyrant within. The heavy oak doors of the antechamber were lined with gold leaf, but they could not muffle the venomous whispers sliding beneath them. Inside the dimly lit corridor of the royal citadel, Leptines and Philistus stood shoulder to shoulder in the shadows, their eyes fixed on the closed double doors that led to the private study where the young tyrant sat locked away with his Athenian master. Look at him in there, Philistus thought, his fingers curling tightly around the ivory handle of his dagger as he glared at the oak barrier. For decades we bled, schemed, and crushed rebellions to build the elder Dionysius' empire. Now, this old pedant from Athens and that ambitious viper Dion intend to sweep it all away with a stroke of a stylus. It is poison, Leptines muttered under his breath, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and mounting panic. He leaned closer to Philistus, casting a wary glance down the empty hall. They whisper into the boy's ear day and night. First, it is geometry and self-restraint. Tomorrow, it will be the purging of the old guard. They mean to strip us of our commands, dismantle our estates, and hand Syracuse over to Athenian sympathizers. A coup dressed up as philosophy, Philistus thought darkly, his mind racing through tactical scenarios of survival and preemption. If Dionysius continues down this path, he will not live to see the winter. The army will not bow to a king who reads Plato instead of inspecting his pikes. The boy is weak, Philistus replied aloud, his tone low and razor-sharp. He is terrified of his own shadow, and Dion knows it. Dion uses philosophy as a velvet glove to hide an iron fist. If we do not act soon to sever the Athenians' hold over the throne, there will be no place left in Syracuse for men of real power. Just then, the heavy doors groaned open, and Plato stepped out into the corridor, his white cloak draped simply over his shoulders, his face serene and unreadable. Behind him emerged Dionysius II, rubbing his temples, his youthful face pale and lined with the restless exhaustion of a sovereign caught between two worlds. Leptines and Philistus instantly straightened, pasting cold, obsequious smiles across their faces as they bowed low to the young ruler. Look at how the tyrant avoids our eyes, Leptines thought, bowing while his heart hammered against his ribs. He's already ashamed of what they are turning him into. Dionysius glanced at his veteran advisors, sensing the cold, suffocating pressure radiating from them. They hate him, Dionysius thought, a sudden wave of defensive paranoia tightening his throat as he looked from Plato to the watchful faces of his courtiers. Philistus looks at me as if I were a child being led to the slaughter. If I listen to Plato, my own generals will mutiny. If I listen to Philistus, I'm nothing more than a tyrant's puppet. Is something amiss, Philistus? Dionysius asked, his voice cracking slightly with defensive pride as he forced his chin up. Nothing that concerns your majesty's infinite wisdom, Philistus replied smoothly, rising from his bow with a gaze that flickered coldly toward Plato. We merely worry that the affairs of the state are being neglected, while your majesty spends his hours deciphering lines in the sand. Enemies gather at our gates, sire. They care little for geometry. Plato paused, his calm, piercing eyes locking onto Philistus. The defense of tyranny always wraps itself in the panic of external threats, Plato thought, reading the raw malice behind the advisor's smile. They fear justice more than they fear any foreign army. An empire defended only by fear and steel is already defeated from within, counselor, Plato said quietly, his voice echoing evenly down the vaulted stone hall. The only question is whether the sovereign rules his own mind or surrenders it to men who profit from his terror. Viper's snare. Their mission was ostensibly to reinforce the Thessalian League, to ensure Alexander adhered to the previous peace terms, and to protect the independence of cities like Larissa. But Pelopidas harbored a deeper intent. To finally neutralize the tyrant, to cut out the festering wound he represented in northern Greece. We have coddled this dog of Pherae for too long, Pelopidas thought. his gaze fixed on the northern horizon as his stallions hoof struck the hard-packed earth of the Thessalian plain. Every month we waste with hollow treaties, more innocent cities bleed. If Epaminondas can reshape the Peloponnese, I can surely purge the single cancer from Thessaly before the year turns. The trap, when it sprang, was not a clash of phalanxes on an open field. It was far more insidious, a testament to Alexander's cunning. Word reached Pelopidas that Alexander, feigning a desire for genuine reconciliation, invited him to a parley, a meeting of peace, and mutual understanding at a neutral location, a small, isolated temple precinct framed by cypress trees on the edge of Alexander's territory. He came without a large armed escort, relying on a small retinue, trusting in the sanctity of the temple, and the implied diplomatic immunity that even the most brutal warlords usually dared not violate. A parley? Ismenias scoffed, pulling his horse to halt as he read the blood-sealed dispatch, deep suspicion clouding his rugged face. The viper offers to share a meal? General, this smells entirely of treachery. Alexander has never honored a truce in his life. He tears up oaths the moment the ink dries. Pelopidas, however, felt a flicker of restless impatience prickle beneath his bronze breastplate. Is he right? The general questioned himself silently, the reins tightening in his calloused grip. Am I walking blindly into a snare just because I wish to end this quickly and return to Boeotia? He is desperate, Ismenias, Pelopidas said aloud, though the internal doubt lingered like a cold shadow. His hold on Thessaly weakens by the day. He knows that he cannot stand against the full might of Thebes if we bring the hammer down. Perhaps he truly seeks terms, knowing the alternative is total annihilation. Or perhaps a small, dangerous voice whispered in the back of his mind, he believes he can outwit me. He thinks my pride is a handle he can turn. And God's help me, that challenge is a lure. No, Pelopidas argued fiercely against his own misgivings, squaring his shoulders against the chill autumn wind. I'm the man who broke the Spartan garrison at the Cadmea in the dead of winter. I just bent the Argead crown of Macedon to my will. A petty, paranoid tyrant of Pherae cannot match my resolve. We go, Pelopidas declared, his jaw set in an unyielding line. We go with our eyes wide open, and our swords ready beneath our cloaks. They approached the temple precinct under a sky that had suddenly clouded over, casting a sickly gray light over the ancient stones. Alexander of Pherae was indeed there, but his retinue, though small, was composed of his most brutal and loyal mercenaries, their eyes cold and calculating. And behind the temple, hidden by a dense copse of trees, Pelopidas felt it, the subtle tremor of hundreds of hidden feet, the faint glint of concealed bronze. The air is too still, Pelopidas thought, his hand instinctively dropping closer to his sword hilt as the hairs on the back of his neck rose. The gods do not dwell in places that smell this sharply of deceit. Alexander, Pelopidas called out, his voice ringing with a forced cordiality. You wish to speak of peace? Alexander, a man whose features were a disturbing blend of refined cruelty and animal cunning, smiled. It was a predator's smile, wide and utterly devoid of warmth. Look at his eyes, Pelopidas observed with a sudden chilling clarity. There is no fear there. Only the sick joy of a trap snapping shut. Indeed, General Pelopidas, Alexander purred. Of peace and of the future of Thessaly. But first, a small matter of security. Before Pelopidas could react, the mercenaries moved. They were swift and coordinated. From the trees, a larger force, lightly armed but numerous, swarmed forward, encircling Pelopidas and his small retinue. The Thebans, though elite, were hopelessly outnumbered, caught in a carefully orchestrated snare. Treachery, Ismenias roared, drawing his sword, but he was instantly overwhelmed, disarmed by 3 hulking mercenaries. I let my pride cloud my judgment, Pelopidas thought, a wave of cold fury washing over him as steel flashed around him. I wanted the glory of a swift end so badly that I walked right into his parlor. Pelopidas, his hand going to the hilt of his sword, found himself facing Alexander directly. The tyrant's eyes gleamed with malicious triumph. Foolish Theban, Alexander sneered, stepping closer, his voice a low hiss. Did you truly believe a man like me would simply surrender his power to your hegemony? Did you truly believe I would not learn from your previous visit? He gestured to his mercenaries, who now had Pelopidas's arms pinned. You came with too few men, relying on your name, on Theban reputation. A fatal error. Pelopidas struggled, his muscles straining against the unyielding grip. Humiliation, hot unbitter, flooded him. To be brought low by a trick? After Leuctra? After everything we have built? You break all sacred laws, Alexander, Pelopidas shouted, his voice vibrating with rage. This will not stand. Thebes will come for you. Epaminondas will burn your city to the ground. Alexander merely laughed, a harsh grating sound that echoed in the temple precinct. Let him come. Let the great Epaminondas come. But he will find his esteemed friend, Pelopidas, a guest in my dungeons. And while he marches, Thessaly will be mine, and Thebes will learn the true cost of meddling in my affairs. He leaned in, his breath foul. You were so quick to take my young nephew, Philip, as a hostage, weren't you? A guarantee, you called it. Well, now I have my guarantee. The greatest hostage in all of Hellas. Pelopidas's eyes blazed with impotent fury. Philip is safely in Thebes, yes, but what good is a distant pawn when the king has taken? He was dragged away, his arms bound, his mind already racing, not with despair, but with the grim, cold calculus of what this capture would mean. Epaminondas will not act rashly. He will plan a siege. He will weigh every option. But I must survive the dark long enough for him to reach these walls. The viper had coiled, and for now it had claimed its prize. The long journey from Macedon, the triumph of securing Philip, now felt like a cruel irony. Thebes was in crisis, and its champion was in chains. The caged lions, the oil lamps flickered low against the whitewashed stone walls of the nursery, casting long, gentle shadows over the rows of narrow pallets. Across the room, the little boys were finally fast asleep. Their small chests rose and fell in steady, rhythmic unison, their faces wiped clean of the day's dirt and mischief, looking entirely innocent, like babies resting after a long battle. Yet, beneath that peaceful slumber lay a harsher reality. They were children torn from their homes in the north, marched south by force, stripped of their own will, and separated from their families. Here in Thebes, they were living currency, hostages bound to the state. Fragile pieces moved across the ruthless chessboards of men. Gorgo and Timoclea sat quietly on the edge of a low wooden bench near the foot of the cots, their eyes lingering tenderly on the sleeping boys. Look at them, Gorgo thought, a quiet ache tightening her chest as she watched little Cletus curl his small hand into a tight fist against his woolen blanket. Dragged across mountains, turned into diplomatic pawns before they even know what a kingdom is. Our men trade in lives and call it politics. Gorgo turned her gaze toward Timoclea, her voice dropping to a low, sorrowful whisper that barely disturbed the quiet air. We are nothing different from these little boys from the north, Timoclea. Our men encaged them here, little lion cubs guarded by two mother lionesses. Timoclea shifted slightly, pulling a stray blanket over Corhagis's shoulder. Her eyes were heavy with a deep, shared weariness. We feed them. We teach them to laugh, we shelter them, Timoclea thought, staring down at her folded hands. But we are just wardens in a grander prison, keeping the enemy's children safe, so our husbands can rule. We all are in this cage together, Timoclea said softly, offering a faint, melancholic reassurance. That is still better than being alone in the cage. Gorgo let out a slow, shuddering breath, her fingers gripping the edge of the bench as the heavy silence of the estate pressed in around them. The doors, those interior walls, the great city walls, and its heavy iron gates, Gorgo whispered, her voice tightening with a sudden, suffocating intensity. Sometimes I feel suffocated in here, Timoclea, in this cage city. Sometimes. I just want to scream until the stones shake. Timoclea looked up, meeting Gorgo's fierce, desperate eyes. Instead of offering stern Spartan fortitude, a gentle, understanding smile touched the corner of Timoclea's mouth. She reached out, resting her warm hand over Gorgo's knuckles. At least now we have these little lion cubs to take care of, Timoclea said gently. Gorgo looked back across the dim room, watching the soft rise and fall of the sleeping boys. The heavy, suffocating weight in her chest slowly began to lift, replaced by a fierce, grounding warmth. They gave us our life back, Gorgo murmured, a genuine, soft smile finally breaking through her guarded expression. They made us alive again, I feel, to be continued in episode 24, Rivers of Exile. Watch and listen now. Watch the cinematic video trailer. Listen to the full saga now. Bookmark Volume 1, Talesius Playlist. Volume 2, Hieros Lachus, the Sacred Band Playlist. Bookmark Volume 1, Divine Oracle Playlist. Join the Vanguard. A new episode drops every single day until the epic conclusion of Volume 2. Each chapter delivers a tight, hyper-focused 10 to 30-minute hit of cinematic historical drama, perfect for your daily plunge into antiquity. Subscribe to follow the bloody rise of the Argead dynasty. Thumbs up to help push our vanguard through the algorithm's gauntlet. Comment below.